Welcome to Defining Racism, Part 2, sponsored by the ACS-START Education, Training, and Resource Team. We truly appreciate you taking the time out to join us for this forum. Our amazing team has worked hard to help develop this forum and deserves a super big shout out. In today's forum, we will discuss the 4 manifestations of racism. Veronica Bridgewaters will lead the discussion on prejudice and microaggressions, and Angela Simonetta will discuss oppression and white supremacy. We will then discuss the 3 expressions of racism: cultural, institutional, and personal, led by Candace Gillette. We will end giving you a historical review of some of the legislative laws that promote systemic and structural racism, led by Scott Miller. In the Defining Racism Part 1 forum, we define racism. I would like to take the time to restate the definition as a reference for the material that we will be discussing today. Racism is the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. Racism involves one group having the power to carry out systematic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of the society and by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. I would like you to take a moment to look at the words in this word cloud. This word cloud not only depicts the problems that sustain racism, it also highlights words that could begin to resolve the problems, like ally, equality, and healing, just to name a few. We ask that you keep these words in mind as we continue through this forum. Again, welcome and enjoy this forum. I will now turn it over to Veronica Bridgewaters to begin the discussion of the manifestations of racism.
Prejudice is an attitude based on limited information, often on stereotypes. Prejudice is usually, but not always, negative. Positive and negative prejudices alike, especially when directed toward oppressed people, are damaging, because they deny the individuality of the person. In some cases, the prejudices of oppressed people, for instance, you can't trust the police, are necessary for survival. No one is free of prejudice. Prejudice makes the victim feel less than fully human. When people are undervalued by others, their self-esteem suffers and they stop trying to improve themselves. Prejudice can often lead to bullying and other forms of discrimination. Take a look at these 2 pictures from Hurricane Katrina, which appeared in the news on the very same day. They both show the same thing roughly: people wading through water with a few groceries. What isn't the same is that the information that appeared along each side of the pictures. The first one indicated that the young man walked through chest-deep water with looted food. And the second picture, they indicated that the 2 residents found the bread and soda at a local grocery store. Just for the record, the photographers did not know how the residents came by the food that they were carrying. Microaggressions are comments or actions that subtly and often unconsciously or unintentionally express a prejudiced attitude toward a member of a marginalized group. Examples are subtle insults or put downs, or a person telling a racist joke and then saying, "I was just joking," or a person saying to an Indian doctor, "Your people must be so proud." It is a form of discrimination. As suggested by the name, microaggressions seem small, but compounded over time, they can have a major impact on a person's experience, physical health, and psychological well-being. In fact, research suggests that subtle forms of interpersonal discrimination like microaggressions are at least as harmful as more overt expressions of discrimination. This toll can lead to anger, depression, and can even lower work productivity and problem-solving abilities. If you've been called out for committing a microaggression, you need to respond with compassion, concern, and humility. You want people to feel respected, so you need to walk the talk. While being called out for a microaggression may be awkward and uncomfortable, you don't want to be defensive. You must not make it about you. When someone tells you that they have been harmed by your words or actions, you need to focus on the injured party. Take a breath, calm yourself. Understand that while you may have made a mistake, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. Make the other person feel heard and follow their lead in the conversation. Offer a genuine apology that acknowledges the impact of the harm your comment caused. Keep striving to be better. It requires grace, humility, and commitment.
Now we will move on to talk about oppression and then white supremacy. Oppression is the systematic subjugation of one social group by a more powerful social group for the social, economic, and political benefit of the more powerful social group. Overall, prejudice plus power equals oppression. Oppression exists when the following four conditions are found. First, the oppressor group has the power to define reality for themselves and for others. Next, the target group takes in and internalizes the negative messages about them and ends up cooperating with the oppressors, meaning that they think and act just like them. Next, genocide, harassment, and discrimination are systematic and institutionalized so that individuals are not necessary to keep it going. And lastly, members of both the oppressor and target groups are socialized to play their roles as normal and correct. We'd like to share with you the Jim Crow laws, which are an example of oppression. Jim Crow laws are statutes that legalized racial segregation. These laws existed for about 100 years during the post-Civil War era until 1968, denying African Americans the right to vote, hold jobs, and get an education. Individuals who defied these laws often faced arrest, fines, violence, and even death. Take a moment to think about this. It has only been 50 years since there was racial segregation in the states. We will be talking more about the Jim Crow laws later in this presentation when Scott Miller talks about the legislative laws that promote systemic and structural racism. Now to talk a little bit about white supremacy. White supremacy culture is the idea that white people and the ideas, thoughts, and beliefs and actions of white people are superior to people of color and to their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. Take a moment to think about the graphic we have posted here. The longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes. White supremacy culture is reproduced by all the institutions of our society. In particular, the media, the education system, Western science, which played a major role in reinforcing the idea of race as a biological truth, with the white race as the ideal or top of the hierarchy, and the Christian church have played central roles in reproducing the idea of white supremacy. For example, that the idea that white is normal, better, smarter, and holy, in contrast to Black and other people and communities of color. White supremacy culture is an artificial, historical constructed culture which expresses, justifies, and binds together the United States white supremacy system. It is the glue that binds together white-controlled institutions into systems and white-controlled systems into the global white supremacy system. White supremacy in the United States was based on the doctrine of scientific or biological racism and relied on pseudoscientific arguments that are not based on what is recognized today as credible scientific research. Next, we will move on to talk about personal, cultural, and institutional types of racism.
Thank you. Today I'll be talking about the three expressions of racism: personal, cultural, and institutional. Cultural expressions of racism are the ways in which the dominant culture is founded upon and then defines and shapes norms, values, beliefs, and standards to advantage white people and oppress people of color. The norms, values, or standards assumed by the dominant society that perpetuate racism. Examples include white and light-skinned women as the basis for our society's standard of beauty. This racial ideology has permeated and maintained itself outside of and within communities of color. Another example is requiring people to speak English, historically American Indians, and today people from Central and South America, as a way of deliberately destroying community and culture. Personal expressions of racism are the ways in which we perpetuate and or assume the idea that white people are inherently better and or people of color are inherently inferior on an individual basis. Examples of this expression is calling someone a racist name or making a racist assumption. Institutional expressions of racism are the ways in which the structures, systems, policies, and procedures of institutions in the United States are founded upon and then promote, reproduce, and perpetuate advantages for white people and the oppression of people of color. The ways in which institutions legislate and structure reality to advantage white people and oppress people of color. The ways in which institutions such as housing, government, education, media, business, healthcare, criminal justice, employment, labor, politics, church perpetuate racism. Examples include people of color underrepresented or misrepresented on television, racially biased standardized tests used to determine who will be admitted to higher education programs and institutions, and historic and ongoing breaking of treaties with Indigenous Native American communities. Thank you all. Now, Scott Miller.
With these next slides, we will review laws during different periods of U.S. history that have promoted systemic racism. The United States was founded on the principle that all people are created equal, yet the nation began with an attempted genocide of indigenous people and the theft of their land. American wealth was built on the labor of kidnapped or enslaved Africans and their descendants. Women were denied the right to vote until 1920, and Black women were denied access to that right until 1965. Same-sex marriage was denied nationally until the Supreme Court ruling in 2015. Just a note, I didn't come up with the words on this intro slide. It's from the book White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. I recommend it. This slide shows the 414-year time period we will be discussing. Notice that the time from 1607, with the first slave boats arriving in 1619, through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a period of time covering over 350 years. Think about that. Over 350 years of slavery or segregation in America. I will now address legislative examples during each time period. The New Nation, a time from 1776 to the Civil War, till the Civil War began, with the colonies declaring independence from England. The Declaration of Independence states, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, it was decided 3/5 of the slave population would be counted for determining direct taxation and representation in the House of Representatives. From 1863 to 1877 is the period of Reconstruction following the Civil War. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved people, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws. However, Black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedoms of African Americans and ensure the availability of cheap labor force after slavery was abolished during the Civil War. PID laws unfairly penalized poor African Americans for crimes such as stealing a farm animal, and vagrancy statutes made it a crime to be unemployed. Many misdemeanors or trivial offenses were treated as felonies with harsh sentences and fines. Some common elements of Black codes were that race was defined by blood. The presence of any amount of Black blood made one Black. Specifically, the one drop of blood rule meant that all it takes is one drop of blood to be defined as Black. Employment was required of all freedmen. Violators faced vagrancy charges. Freedmen could not assemble without the presence of a white person. Freedmen were assumed to be agricultural workers, and their duties and hours were tightly regulated. Freedmen were not taught to read or write. Public facilities were segregated. Violators of these laws were subject to being whipped, branded, or jailed. Also during this time, voting poll taxes, a payment required to vote in an election, and literacy tests were also used to disenfranchise impoverished or minority voters. The Jim Crow era, a time following Reconstruction up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. They were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. Segregation was upheld by the Supreme Court in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed states to have separate but equal facilities and institutions. As the image of the drinking fountain shows, facilities and institutions were not equal. Example of state laws that were upheld were schools for white children and schools for Negro children shall be conducted separately. Books shall not be interchangeable between the white and the colored schools, but shall continue to be used by the race first using them. All passenger stations in this state operated by the motor transportation company shall have separate waiting rooms or space and separate ticket windows for white and colored races. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of color, religion, sex, or national origin. Provisions of the Civil Rights Act forbid discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. And yet, more than 50 years after the end of legal segregation and sweeping national civil rights legislation, racism and racial inequality endure in the United States. I didn't cover all the laws in my overview, and we will provide you access to a more extensive list. To me, this slide is very impactful. It shows one of the manifestations of laws and promote systemic and structural racism. As an example, of the prisoners aged 35 through 39, 958 out of 100,000 are white, and 5 times as many are Black, 4,832 out of 1,000. I'll close with this quote from Harry Rubenstein, the National Museum of American History curator, while you think about pie. Democracy means everyone can participate. It means you are sharing power with people you don't know, don't understand, might not even like. That is the bargain. Some people over time have felt very threatened by that notion. I will now turn it back to Kenya for summative comments.
Thank you, Scott. In the end, it is our hope that you leave understanding that racism equals race prejudice plus social and institutional power. Racism equals a system of advantage based on race. Racism equals a system of oppression based on race. Racism equals a white supremacy culture. If you have yet to understand or question any of these statements, that's okay. Our hope is to open dialogue. Again, we'd like to thank you for joining the Defining Racism Part 2 forum. If you have any questions or comments or like to join ACS-START, please contact us at ACS-START@facs.org. Thank you and have a good day.